Princeton. He will be presenting Growth and the Fragmentation of Production. It's a paper co-authored with Johannes Bohn, that's also here today to help answer questions. Ezra, please, you can take over.
Okay, thanks, Bruno. This is a paper about the division of labor, which is a topic that goes all the way back to Adam Smith. We're going to be thinking about or the division of production in a very particular way. So if you think about a supply chain in which goods need to be produced using a sequence of steps, the particular notion of specialization that we're going to be interested in is how different plants divide up the steps in a supply chain, and how specialization among plants in the task in the supply chains is related to growth. So we're going to start by showing some just empirical exploration of the relationship between the organization of firms in a supply chain and growth using data on manufacturing plants in India. So first, we're going to show you, I guess, some correlations at the macro level. What's the relationship between income per capita and how much plants specialize. Then we'll look at some micro correlations, looking at a point in time which of the plants that seem to be more specialized than other ones. Then we'll try to get at some notion of causality, what might be causing what, and we'll particularly ask how do firms change their production structure, how many tasks they choose to produce in response to changes in demand. And that also tell us a little bit about the mechanism, but also how we might want to model it'll form our modeling choices when we go to that. So second, we're going to put this together in a model that's both going to be able to rationalize the patterns that we see, but we're also going to explore its implications for growth. And as you'll see down the road, I guess the mechanism that we think is explaining the patterns that we see, I think search is kind of at the heart of it. Let me just jump right into the data and tell you about what we find. So again, we're going to be using data from the annual survey of industry from India over the last 30 plus years. This is plant level panel data with many all the large and many of the medium-sized plants in the economy. And the really nice feature of this data we're going to be taking advantage of is there's great information about the particular inputs and outputs that the firm uses. And as we show you, it's going to give us a lot of information about how firms are producing, what the production process is. And most of what we're doing, when we talk about a product, we're going to be talking about products at the 5-digit level. So you can see some examples here of what kind of detail that means. So let me give you a little bit of color about what you can see when you look at the particular details of the inputs and outputs that firm uses. So over here on the right over here, you can see we're showing you a bunch of data on plants that produce polished diamonds. And you can see for many of the plants that produce polished diamonds, you can see they use as an input rough diamonds. Almost all of their input expenditures are on rough diamonds. There are many other plants where all of their input expenditures are on cut diamonds, and some more down here that use industrial diamonds. And just by staring at this, you kind of get the sense that these plants are just doing different amounts of tasks in-house, right? So some plants are buying the rough diamonds and cutting them and then polishing them, and some are just buying cut diamonds and polishing them. And you can see the same thing with people who make cotton cloth. To make cotton cloth, some plants buy cloth, some plants buy yarn, some buy cotton. All right, and you can see that pretty clearly in the data. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to try to take this information and construct a measure of how many tasks in production a plant does, kind of systematically for all the plants that we see in our data. And we're going to call this the firm's the number of tasks a firm does, the number of sequential tasks, the vertical span of production. And this is going to be based on some earlier work that Giannis and I had done. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We're going to do this in 2 steps. So first, we're going to construct for each, so fix an output. So here we're going to think of the example of cotton shirts. And we're going to ask for cotton shirt producers again, how many tasks they do in production. The first step is to figure out for each input that shows up somewhere along the supply chain for cotton shirts, how many plants does that input typically pass through before it turns into a cotton shirt? So you can see in our data of cotton shirt producers, some cotton shirt producers by cloth and some by yarn, and some cloth producers by yarn. In this stylus example, cloth is always one step away from shirts, whereas yarn is farther away. So here on average, 1.7 steps away from cotton shirts. So we're going to conclude from this that yarn is farther away from, more tasks need to be done to turn yarn into shirts than cloth into shirts. Okay, so that gives us a notion of how far each input that shows up in the supply chain is from the output. Then what we can do with that information is we can ask for any individual plant, does a plant tend to buy inputs that are close to the output or far away from the output? Here we're going to conclude if a shirt producer buys cloth, then they are doing one task in-house, or they have a vertical span of one because they're buying an input that's one step away. Whereas if we see a different shirt producer that buys yarn as an input, they're going to have we're going to measure the vertical span as 1.7. They're going to be buying an input that's further away. And this is going to be, we can do this systematically for all the different industries in our data and come up with a measure of, for each industry, how many sequential tasks is the firm doing in-house. Is there a question?
Yeah, so what is the idea of these weights? I'm thinking more like, you know, when you think about this, I think about like something on the environment,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's a technology, right?
Yeah.
Distribution of the 30% or 70% there is kind of an endogenous thing that might be a bunch of other things. But you're using as your measured distance. How exactly?
Yeah, good question. So we're not thinking of this as like a measure of technology per se. You're absolutely right that these choices of whether to use yarn or cloth or whatever, and which fraction of firms do this is endogenous. Lots of this stuff is endogenous. But I think what we want to argue is that this is a measure that this gives sort of an ordering over the different goods that we can construct across the different for any industry just looking at the input-output tables. You're right that it's not a measure of technology, but we're just looking at something that is again endogenous, but we think corresponds to how far away an input goes to. So I wouldn't take the units of one. I wouldn't take that so literally. Just think that things that are farther away, we're going to argue are more distant. And when we go to the model, we're going to try to do this in the proper way, but this is just for some reduced form evidence.
Can I ask you, maybe it's a follow-up to Bruno's question. So I mean, you may have a technology that it doesn't need to produce a cloth to go to the shirt, something. I mean, that's okay, or? Yeah,
so in that case, so amazing there's some intermediate thing between cloth and shirts also. So then we'll be missing that step in production if we don't see any firms in our data that do that intermediate step. So again, all we want to take, this is going to be like again not a rough measure that will tell us kind of the rough ordering of the different inputs that plants use in their data. And just again arguing if a plant uses an input that typically passes through more plants on the way to the output, that they're going to be doing more steps in production than if a plant that uses inputs that typically pass through fewer plants. So that's all we want you to take away from this.
Ezra, can I ask a clarification question? So on the diagram, I see cotton cloth only once.
Yes.
So and they sell to cotton shirt. So we say that cloth is one plant away, but for cotton yarn, I see twice.
Yes.
So how is this number 1.7 calculated, or can I calculate it from the numbers on the diagram, or is it like some hidden step?
Yeah, it's from the numbers on the diagram. So what we look at is so in input-output tables, you'll see different paths from every output to inputs. So what we do is we calculate all the different paths from the output to a particular input that shows up somewhere in the supply chain. So in this path to cotton yarn, it is 2 steps away. In this path to cotton yarn is 1 step away, and this is just a value-weighted average of the number of steps away.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, so just to give you an example of so that this is hopefully giving you something sensible. So when we look at different industries, you can see that the inputs seem like they're showing up sort of in the distance from the output to the inputs are showing up in the right places. So for shirts, right, cloth is closer to shirts than yarn or than cotton. You look at aluminum, another one, you can see you know, copper and anodes and scrap and oxide are closer to aluminum ingots than bauxite and coal, kind of as you would expect. Again, and what we're going to try to conclude is that a shirt producer that uses an anode is doing fewer steps in-house than an ingot producer that uses anodes is doing fewer steps in-house than an ingot producer who's using coal. Okay, so, and again, this just go back to the picture in the diagram. These producers, these diamond producers down here who are using rough diamonds, we're going to classify them as having a long vertical span, doing more steps in-house, whereas these producers who are using cut diamonds have a shorter vertical span. They're doing fewer steps in-house. Okay, so that's going to be our measurement, and we're just going to do some exploration to see what happens. So the first question we're going to ask is, how does the specialization of plants change with development? Okay, so what we're doing here is looking at the cross-section of across districts within India and asking, do the richer or poorer, as measured by GDP per capita, have more specialized plants or fewer specialized plants? Again, controlling for industry year fixed effects. So everything is within industry, and you can see pretty clearly in districts with higher GDP per capita, you see that the vertical spans tend to be lower. Okay, plants are doing fewer tasks in-house in richer districts, right? And that seems to, so right, they seem to be more specialized. This holds in the cross section. We can also look in the time dimension in states that are growing or that grew faster. We see individual plants switch their organizations to become more specialized, right? These are just two different ways of looking at the correlation, both in the cross section and the time series. The second fact we're going to look at is within a place at a point in time, which plants are the ones that seem to be more specialized, or if there are the more specialized plants, the larger or smaller in terms of sales. Sort of we found something that was a little bit surprising to us. So in a lot of other settings, we often end up with the thing that firms that are or plants that are larger do more things. And here we end up with kind of the opposite, in that the firms that are more specialized are the ones that have lower sales. They sell less, right? There's the firms with higher sales have shorter vertical spans. And this holds, again, both in the cross-section within an industry at a point in time. It also holds in the time dimension. When a plant grows, they also tend to shrink their vertical span, right? They become more specialized. Okay, so there seems this very kind of clear in the both in the cross-section and the time dimension. All right, so the next thing we want to do is try to get a little bit about say something about what's causing what. So again, both the plant's size and how specialized it is are endogenous choices, or choices that the plant is going to make. And we showed you that they seem to be correlated in a certain kind of way. We want to start saying a little bit about what might be causing these changes of a firm. And so the way we're going to do that is try to look at changes in the demand facing a firm and ask, when the demand facing a firm changes, how does the firm change how specialized it is, right? Demand goes up, that might change how specialized it is. And so we're going to use here two instruments for demand facing a firm, or I guess these are, the first is, both of them have been kind of well studied, so we're kind of taking these off the shelf. The first is we're going to look at changes in demand that come from changes in import competition. So in the early 90s, there was a big trade liberalization in India where tariffs came down across a bunch of products. So the backstory is that for decades, India had incredibly high tariffs with lots of variation across industries. There was a crisis, a balance of payments crisis, and part of the IMF coming in was they told India, you have to lower your tariffs. And so all the tariff rates came down to a pretty low level, but the change in the tariff rate was mostly determined by how high the tariff was set 30 years before. And so the change in the tariff is sort of unrelated to current trends. Lots of people in the trade literature have tried to document this. And so we're thinking of if the tariff in my industry comes down, I'm going to face more foreign competition. I guess it could be a negative demand shock for me when there's this tariff liberalization. There's going to be a second instrument we're going to use for demand, kind of a Hummels type instrument. And so the way to think about that one is different industries export to different mix of destination countries. And sometimes a destination country will increase its demand for a particular product. And you can see that by maybe increasing imports from India, but also from other places. And so we want to ask, when some destination increases their demand for a product, how does that should be increasing the demand facing the Indian plants that are exporting to those destinations. And so we're going to construct these foreign destination demand shifters for exporting products, and that should be hopefully orthogonal to what's going on in India, right? And we got to do the right leave outs to make sure that that's the case. But anyway, think of these as two different kinds of demand shifters that will face plants. And this is show you kind of the first stage here. So when the output, when the tariff of industry is higher, there's more protection from imports. The demand facing firms is higher, and you can see that plants sales are higher. Second, you can see that this last one is this Hummel shock. When destinations increase their demand for particular products, the Indian plants that are creating those products seem to expand as well. Okay, so just two different instruments. Okay, so now we're going to ask the question: when a plant faces a positive demand shock or some kind of demand shock, how does that change their vertical span? They're going to expand, but also how do they change their specialization? And you can see here, so this first two columns are the OLS. The second two columns are the trade liberalization IV. The third set of columns are the Hummel's export demand change. And you can see kind of across these different specifications, you can see that when a plant gets a positive demand shock that increases its sales, the firm reduces its vertical span. They seem to become more specialized. Yep.
Maybe like one thing that I'm afraid will be a little bit related to what you're doing is related to financial frictions, and that is like either like the IMF case, but I think in general we can think that if there's some structure growth in particular industry, it might be easier for maybe someone that was an employee in a big company with an initial project start competing firm to take some of these things, and then the industry become more specialized. But it's like totally different channels. Just that if you relax financial frictions, you tend to lower entry costs for a lot of firms, and then looks like firms are just specializing, but it's more about all the firms entering and get part of the share that they will produce in-house.
So everything we've shown you is within plants. So these are all within plant changes right here. So yeah. The macro correlation could be, so lots of things might be explained in the macro correlation. So I think we don't want to talk, we don't have a lot to say about what is driving that. But these within plant correlation, we think that these are all within plant changes.
I mean, I find maybe there's no, like, it's just something to think about. This is not unrelated, right? Like, I don't know, you really, like, you see, like, say, Elon Musk interview and say, I want to produce batteries in-house because I don't believe the supplier can fill up the demand. Yep. So it's not like, so if he's more confident in the supply chain, he might take it out of so it kind of depends on what is the ability of the other firms to produce, not just the firm. And anyways, like
that's going to be part of our that mechanism will be in the model, that when the suppliers for a particular input are better, you're going to be more willing to use those suppliers. There's going to be some one thing that actually shows up here is a question of there's differences across firms, right? So one question is, why are the bigger firms and smaller firms are actually making different decisions about how much to specialize? And it seems like the bigger ones are the ones who seem like they are willing to specialize more, the ones that sell more.
Okay. All right. I want to see them more. Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. So one other thing that's kind of we find kind of interesting and also kind of important for understanding this kind of the structure of production is also when it turns out when firms get a positive demand shock, they shrink the number of inputs that they buy, right? So they become more specialized, but they also buy fewer inputs. So what is going on there? The simplest way we have to think about it is, imagine a car producer that it might buy an engine or might produce the engine in-house. So if they buy an engine, right, they're doing fewer things in production. They just buy one input. If they make their engine in-house, then they need to buy ball bearings and aluminum, right? And if they have that structure, if they produce one step of the chain in-house, if they only do one step in-house, then they only buy one input. If they become less specialized, right, if they do more things in-house, they're buying more inputs, right? If I do 2 steps, I need to do 2 inputs, right? So this structure of production we call like a production tree, where the more steps you do, the more inputs you need to buy in order to do them. And I think that's kind of the rough way we have to rationalize why firms that are more specialized would be buying fewer inputs, right? And that's different than the what's often modeled for in the outsourcing literature, where you have a firm has just a bunch of tasks that it needs to do, and it can either outsource each one of them or do it themselves. In that case, you would kind of find the opposite, the correlation. This one, you really need to make sense of these patterns. You need to have a production structure where there's a tree in how outputs go to, or how the inputs go to the output.
Ezra, can I ask you a question?
Yep.
So now this to me sounds like when there is more demand for the final product of the firm kind of wants to speed up the production process by reducing the inputs, by buying more intermediate type of inputs rather than raw. But you also mentioned that large firms tend to specialize more compared to small firms. But don't we think that small firms will have a bigger need to, speed up and specialize more?
Yeah, perhaps. So I think we'll try to. There are a bunch of different ways you might think about what might be driving the correlations. I think the one we've found that we think can rationalize these patterns is one where we'll argue that it has to do with large firms being more willing to search for suppliers and find it more worth their while to search for suppliers. I think that the image, one image we have, if you want to think about like large versus small firms, like in a life cycle, like is like these small plants, they kind of they're doing what they do, and they kind of tinker with everything themselves and kind of do everything themselves. As you get bigger, you find it more worthwhile to go out and really find a good supplier that kind of fits you, and that's kind of the difference we have in mind for these large and small firms.
Yeah, in my story, I ignored the cost of searching for supplier. Okay, that's the cost side of the things. Okay, thank you.
Okay, one last piece of the puzzle is what we call so there was an economist 100 years ago named Alan Young who talked about Smithian growth, but talked about how the specialization is related to network economies and economies of scale at different industries or network externalities. And so we're going to use this framework a little bit to see if we can measure some of these network externalities or industry level economies of scale. And so the way we're going to do this is the following. Suppose we're thinking about a plant in industry Omega, and that plant buys its inputs from, or typically buys inputs from, some upstream industry Omega hat. And we're going to ask the question, if there are more suppliers in this industry Omega hat, right? If there's some growth in the number of potential suppliers, they become more attractive. Does that help industry Omega, right? And what we were going to try to detect here is whether there's kind of increasing returns to scale in this upstream industry Omega. And the way we're going to do this is the following. So these upstreams, these suppliers in industry Omega hat, they sometimes sell their good to other industries as well, right? And these other industries are also purchase this input. And we're going to ask what happens if, suppose these other industries face more import competition, right? They're going to shrink, and they're going to shrink how much they demand from the Omega hat. And when they do that, you might find some exit, right? Some of these producers are going to shrink, and some of them are going to exit in this Omega hat industry. I want to ask, when that happens, how does that change the sales in this industry Omega, right? If there was constant returns to scale in this industry Omega hat, then what goes on in these other output industries shouldn't affect the cost of supplying industry Omega. But if there's increasing returns to scale, then when there's more import competition here, the number of producers here is going to shrink, and industry Omega is going to shrink as well, because the cost has gone up if there's increasing returns to scale. And that's what we're going to ask in this next regression. We're going to ask whether when there's import competition here as an instrument for the number of producers here, how does that affect sales over here? And this is where we're trying to get at these network externalities, or these industry level increasing returns to scale. And that's exactly what we find. So what these regressions tell you is essentially that this upstream industry, this Omega hat, has this increasing, at least industry level increasing returns to scale. When the number of producers goes up, sales in the downstream industry, Omega, go up as well, right? Indicating some kind of increasing returns to scale. All right, those are with the facts.
So Ezra, sorry, when you say increasing return to scale, you mean literally, or you mean like maybe some market mechanism akin to that? I mean,
it's as a reduced form. That when the industry expands because of demand somewhere else, it seems like the people who use the input get a lower cost of the input.
Okay. It could be through market competition or something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. There could be lots of mechanisms there. Yeah. Yeah. So there's not literally an industry production function. Okay. So let me. I'm going to go through the model. I'm probably going to spend most of my time on a simple version of the model. If there's time, I'll talk about a more quantitative version that we're still working on calibrating. But the simple version of the model, I think, is going to give you most of the intuition of what we're doing, and what we think drives these patterns and the implications for growth. Okay, so in the simple model, imagine there are a bunch of industries, symmetric industries, arranged around a circle. And industry Omega, like a cotton producer, will have, in principle, two ways of producing. It can buy industry Omega minus one industry that's one step behind it. Think of this as cloth. A shirt producer can buy cloth, or it can buy yarn, which is two steps behind it. So there's first going to be some entry stage, which I'll talk about down the road. But a firm is born with some ex ante productivity Q, right? And again, there are going to be, again, these two different ways of producing. You could do either one step in-house. You could have a short vertical span, or you can do two steps in-house. You could buy shirts from yarn, right? You can and do these two steps in-house. And there's going to be some the decision that a plant has to make is it's going to exert search effort to go out and find potential suppliers of cloth and of yarn there's going to be some matching process, which is going to deliver 2 sets of potential suppliers of cloth and yarn. And then after it found all these potential suppliers, it's going to produce in the least costly way possible. It's going to choose one of these suppliers and produce in the way that minimizes its unit cost. And so where we're going to do this, so again, literally the production function, a firm J's unit cost of making good omega, making a shirt, is going to be related to the productivity that's born with. And the second step, so turning cloth into yarn, takes some cloth and some labor. And alpha is the share, it's the share on cloth, the intermediate input share in production. So this cost of cloth, we call this CJ tilde because it's not literally the price of cloth, but the effective price of cloth. So what is, if the firm is buying cloth from a supplier, it's going to have a bunch of potential suppliers of cloth. There's going to be a price that each of those suppliers is willing to sell to that firm J. And for each of those potential suppliers, there's going to be a match-specific productivity that's drawn from we're going to have it drawn essentially from a Pareto distribution with a Pareto distribution. And the effective cost of buying cloth from a supplier is going to be the minimal, whatever gives you the best combination, whichever supplier gives you the best combination of price and match-specific productivity. And with the functional forms we're going to make, the effective cost is going to follow a Weibull distribution, where the mean of the distribution has these terms over here, and it has a shape parameter zeta. So let me tell you about this. So first, the firm exerts some search effort. It tells you, and second, there's going to be some matching process that turns the search effort and the matching into matches. And the number of matches, or the measure of matches that the firm gets, depends on how many suppliers there are of the particular input. So we are building on some work by Yuhei Miyauchi, who did some work trying to document that in firm-to-firm trade, he argued that there, in a place with more suppliers, the matching efficiency is higher, whereas there is not a lot of congestion from being in a place where there are more buyers. And what to do this, he looked at when a firm lost its supplier due to a supplier bankruptcy for exogenous reasons, like a traffic or a weather incident or something like that. A firm loses a supplier, how fast do you find a new supplier? And if there are more suppliers around, you find them faster. But if there are more buyers looking, it didn't really seem to affect your speed of finding a new supplier. And so we were building on this and building that the matching function has this increasing returns, but in particular, the arrival rate of a new supplier depends on the number of suppliers out there, but there's not congestion. So that's just we do that. Finally, this other component that goes into the mean of the effective cost of buying shirts is the average price that shirt producers are charging, which is as a particular average of the shirt producers there. And finally, this Weibull has the shape parameter zeta, which is related to the dispersion in the match-specific productivities. Okay, so that's the if you want to outsource cloth, that's how it works. You get some effective cost of cloth. A second possibility is that you can buy yarn from a supplier. And this, we have sort of a nested production function where a firm first buys yarn, turns that into cloth, and then just plugs that cloth into its other production function here. And so here, again, it's just the exact same production function to turn cloth into yarn, with one exception is that there's a task-specific productivity B, which I'll talk about in a second, which is random to the firm. So again, the same matching process and search effort goes into finding potential suppliers of yarn. And so the effective cost of yarn is going to be, again, Weibel with the same shape parameter. It turns out when this task-specific productivity follows a stable distribution, a Levy stable distribution, that the effective cost of producing omega minus 1, of producing cloth in-house, follows a Weibel distribution with a shape parameter zeta. Okay, and notice that this zeta over here, for the effective cost of producing cloth in-house, is the same as the shape parameter of this Weibel distribution of buying cloth from a supplier. And because these two have the same shape parameters, our usual discrete choice magic works just fine in this model. So you put all this together, the firm is going to have a decision about how much to search for suppliers, and it's going to do this as follows. So a firm is going to think about.
Ezra, do you mind I interrupt before you?
Yes.
You go back to like this stay in my mind the way you model the externalities of
Yes.
the number of farms. So like just trying to understand what is buying, like if there was the number of buyers could create a congestion, so there is a demand shock that could put into my industry that could potentially hurt me through that channel, because
Potentially, that's right.
become more difficult to find. So now this, so you could get an ambiguous, is that the goal, right? Like you could get an ambiguous sign, and because you shut that channel, a positive shock will always increase the number of suppliers, and it kind of helps me.
Yeah, so there are two. It's a good question. So there are two different types of facts that we're after. So first is a cross-sectional fact, where firms that are larger are going to be more specialized, tend to be more specialized than firms that are smaller. And so for that, what we assume about the matching function doesn't really matter, because every firm is facing the same matching function. Where this is going to matter is when there's like you said, when there's like an industry level demand shock. Some firms are going to want to search more than other ones, and that might lead to some congestion potentially, and that could, in principle, be a countervailing force that might dampen what we're showing you a little bit. So I think you can play around with different types of matching functions. I don't think that's a huge deal. I think what will happen is that when we show you some numerical simulations at the end, you might think that there'll be a dampening effect if congestion is in play.
Thanks.
Yep. So when we put this all together, we ask, this is how much a firm's, given how much a firm searches, this is an expression for the firm's profit. So A omega is a summary statistic for industry level demand. It has some endogenous things in there, but that's common to all firms. Omega Q, remember, is the productivity a firm is born with. This term in here kind of summarizes how the kind of expected profitability of the firm, given how much it searches and given the cost of suppliers, and how it chooses between, once it finds all these potential suppliers out there, its optimal choice of that. And then there's going to be some isoelastic search costs. It can search for suppliers of cloth and suppliers of yarn, and there's just some labor cost of doing that. Okay, so from this expression, you can kind of already see the beginnings of this non-homotheticity in. So we're going to call the non-homotheticity the difference in that bigger firms seem to have a different organization of production than smaller firms. Right? I give you an increasing demand shock, you kind of change your how much you specialize, and we could call that a non-homotheticity. What we can show is that if firms are searching optimally here, the firms that that use the probability of having a shorter vertical span, right, of using cloth instead of yarn, that's going to be higher for firms that are born with higher productivity, and also higher if the final consumer's demand for the industry rises. All right, and this is going to correspond to this relationship between size and the vertical span that we saw in the data. And so I'll show you how to see this in two ways. So first one I'll show you is that when you look at how search effort enters the expected profit function. Search effort for suppliers that are one step away, right, the cloth, enters a little bit differently than search effort for suppliers who are 2 steps away, just because when you buy yarn, to turn that into yarn, you need to combine it with labor to turn that yarn into cloth. And so when you search for yarn, this is right, this H enters linearly, whereas there's curvature, right? This search effort over here has it has curvature because that yarn needs to be combined with labor, right? And so as you increase your search effort, the returns to searching kind of diminish more for this upstream task, more than for this downstream task, right? When you buy yarn, the returns to searching seem like they diminish more than the returns to buying to searching for cloth suppliers. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of intuition for what's going on. There are kind of 2 ingredients that are important for this, right? So firms have essentially a make or buy decision. They could make a cloth in-house or buy it from a supplier. And these are kind of substitutes in production, right? You do one or the other. But the key difference between these 2 options are that when you make something in-house, it requires labor to produce that. Okay, so if a firm expects to be very large, right? They're born with a high ex-ante, a high Q, a high ex-ante productivity. They expect to be large. What do? They're going to search more, right? It's more worth their while to search for suppliers because they're kind of like fixed costs in production. So the larger you're going to be, the more you want to search. So the more you search, then the more the intermediates that you're going to use are going to tend to be cheaper relative to labor, right? So what a firm can do is they can search and lower the cost of intermediates. They can't do that to labor. So labor is still going to be expensive, but when you search a lot, the cost of intermediates goes down. And so the more you search, the more likely you are to buy the intermediate yourself, because that helps you save on the labor you might need to turn the yarn into cloth. Whereas if I search a lot, I can probably find a really good producer of cloth, right? I can and they'll take care of doing that, and I don't have to spend labor turning yarn into cloth. So if I expect to be very large, I'm going to search a lot, and it's going to make it so that I'm more likely to buy to save on labor. In contrast, if I expect to be small, I'm not going to search a lot, and so its intermediates are going to be relatively expensive relative to labor, right? If I don't search very much, I'm only going to find kind of mediocre producers. And then how do I save? I produce things in-house, right? If intermediates are very expensive, I want to use labor rather than intermediates, and that's going to make me make stuff in-house more. So here, the large firms are going to be more likely to buy, exerting a lot of search effort, and more likely to buy. The small firms are going to be not exerting very much search effort and more likely to make stuff in-house. Okay, so this logic is going to be even reinforced more by a firm not deciding just how much to search in general, but how much to search their effort toward suppliers of cloth versus suppliers of yarn, which is farther away. So if I'm expected to search, if I'm going to really big, I'm going to expect to search a lot, right? I search a lot. I kind of going to expect that I'm going to find a pretty good supplier of cloth. Right, I'm going to expect that I'll buy, right, and probably not make things in house. And so then it's not really worth my while to find a good supplier of yarn, right? If I'm expecting to produce to buy, why bother searching for yarn suppliers? And so I'm going to tilt my search effort toward these more downstream suppliers, right? The suppliers of cloth, because I know it's not worth my while to buy that labor.
So Ezra, can I ask you a question? I mean, right now you're talking as if this is, I think in the model it is static.
Yes,
but I mean, over time, I might be small and get lots of samples over time.
Yeah.
So how do you think about that?
It's a good question. So I think when we've explored this, we do see that in the life cycle, that when firms get older, they start out more specialized, and they do become more they start out not specializing, right? They have a longer vertical span, and over their life cycle, they tend to be more likely to specialize. And I think it's one mechanism is exactly what you said. Just you kind of accumulate draws and find better suppliers. It's just not worth it to do stuff in house. Okay, so one last element of the model is we told you there's an entry stage to the game. Here, where on each industry, there's going to be sort of representative entrant with a constant elasticity of transformation entry function, where a firm kind of takes expected profits in each industry is given and chooses how much to enter in each of the different industries. And there are two parameters here. One parameter, beta, tells you sort of how much, holding fixed the total amount of entry, how much, how easy it is to substitute entering in one industry versus the other, and that's beta. And second parameter is how much, if profits go up, how much does representative entrant want to increase total entry, and that's chi. Anyway, it's not too important. Just note that this specification can nest both free entry when both beta and chi go to infinity. It can also nest just an inelastic, just a fixed set of firms when these parameters go to zero. So we're going to assume that that we're not completely in the free entry world, so that when the size of the economy goes up, not all of that is just absorbed by increasing the number of firms. Some of it is absorbed by existing firms getting a little bit bigger, which kind of is going to change their incentives of how much to search. Okay, so give you a little bit of the macro implications of the model. So first thing I want to ask is, suppose there's what we call an economy-wide increase in scale, right? So suppose we just increase the total amount of labor in the economy. So what happens here is that, right? So what I'm showing you here is just the economy's response, or the elasticity to a marginal change in labor. So let me step back for a second. We have this economy with symmetric industries, and for this exercise, I'm going to assume that one more simplification, which is that all industries are symmetric, but also that there's only when firms are born, they're born with a single efficiency. They're born with a single ex-ante productivity queue instead, rather than some distribution. And what that simplification buys us is that all firms, or that the share of firms that are outsourcing in the economy turns out to be a sufficient statistic for how the economy responds to a change in labor, right? So you can think about changing all kinds of micro parameters, or all kinds of productivity parameters and whatnot, but still the share of firms that are outsourcing is a sufficient statistic for the response of various economic outcomes to a change in labor. So the first thing I want to show you is in this graph over here down at the bottom, graph A, that when you increase the amount of labor in the economy, the output per capita is going to expand. And we see that by this curve is positive over here. So the elasticity of output per capita to labor is always positive. Right. So here the economy is exhibiting sort of aggregate increasing returns to scale in labor. And where is that? Sorry, is there a question from the audience?
Yes, there's one.
Yeah, it would be logical to, so I'll read it out loud. It would be logical to assume that more upstream products are more standardized commodities, while downstream products are more sophisticated and specific. Would that imply that at the first stage, you need to invest more effort to find a proper quality supplier? Do your parametric assumptions incorporate this, or do you assume that search function parameters are the same at both stages? Good question. So at this level, let me start by saying that we think this is not an issue for our empirical facts at the beginning, because what we're looking at is a change in demand and how firms in the same industry that have the same input requirements, same production functions, source differently. So I think that our empirical stuff are fine. When we get to the more general model, is going to have all kinds of heterogeneity across industries, and so it might be that some industries need right, for an industry, the more downstream inputs are more, you need to search a lot to find a good supplier, where the more upstream industries, you don't need to search a lot to find a good supplier. Those are all, we're going to allow for all those differences across industries in the more general model. There's a potentially a different way you can build in heterogeneity across relationship-specific and more standardized inputs, where it might be that for relationship-specific, or for more standardized commodities, you just need to search a little bit and you'll find the best supplier, right? There's not much differences across suppliers. Whereas for relationship-specific inputs, there's a lot of gains from searching a lot, right? That I when I search more, there's a lot of differences across suppliers, and so the search effort is more rewarding. And this is definitely something you could build into the more general model. We haven't done that. I will say that we the ideas you have are actually match pretty well our empirical findings. So we didn't put it in this paper, but you can divide up industries into ones that tend to use relationship-specific inputs and ones that don't. And most of the patterns that we find are actually stronger for industries that tend to use relationship-specific inputs, which makes us, that's one of the reasons why we thought search was a good mechanism to explain this, because search is kind of more important in these industries with relationship-specific inputs. So it's a good question. So I'm not sure it'll end up in the paper, but it's definitely something that seems to be empirically relevant. Okay, back to this counterfactual. So in this economy, you see again that as you increase labor, output per capita rises, right? So it's not just that output rises in proportion to labor, but output per capita increases. So there's kind of this increasing returns to scale. Where is that coming from? So what we have here is, remember, C bar is like the a cost index for the average cost of inputs. Average effective cost of an input for firms. So when you're searching for suppliers, the average cost of inputs kind of summarizes how the cost of inputs. And you can see that this depends on a few things. What I've shown you here is that when the economy expands, right, the change in the average cost among suppliers might rise for three reasons. Well, it's really two reasons. One is that search effort might expand, right? So some of the additional labor in the economy is going into additional search effort, right? And additional search effort is going to reduce the effective cost of suppliers. And the second reason you might get this is that if there's more entry, then, so mu is the elasticity of the matching function. I don't think I said. If there's more entry, there's more gains. It's easier to find a good supplier, right? The matching function or the arrival rate of good suppliers increases, and there's like the gains in variety across suppliers. So the stronger the arrival rate increases with the number of suppliers out there, the more you'll get increasing returns here. So both the increasing entry of potential suppliers and increasing search effort are things that make it so that the average cost of suppliers will go down when the economy expands, right? More labor goes into search and more labor goes into entry, and both of those increase output per capita. And you can see that right, so this is just showing you that all those respond positively. And you can see that if the economy is such that many firms are outsourcing, right? Many firms are already outsourcing. That means many firms are have a large expenditure share on intermediate inputs. These forces are stronger in the economy, right? So if the economy, we're going to say more developed in the sense that it's larger and more firms are outsourcing, the response of output per capita is larger because firms are relying more on intermediate inputs. And so when the effective cost of intermediate inputs goes down, you get a bigger bang for your buck, like a bigger intermediate input multiplier, right? An input output multiplier. So I think you maybe seen models with roundabout production that have a multiplier for output per capita. This is one in which the multiplier, the input output multiplier is endogenous and rises with development, right? So the increasing returns to scale get stronger with development because firms are outsourcing more, and these mechanisms have a stronger mechanism. So as the economy expands, firms tend to outsource more. They become more likely to outsource because they get this, because they find it they're more willing to expend search effort. Okay, so I got just 5 more minutes. So let me give you, I guess, again, yeah, so this is the intuition I told you before. I'll do 1 minute on it, and then I'll go to the more general model. So again, the sequence is labor expands, search effort and entry both rise, and that leads to this aggregate increasing returns to scale. But the response of the economy is larger if firms tend to be more specialized. And so there's this feedback that when the economy is larger, firms become more specialized, and then that increases the response itself to the change in the size of the economy. So the response of output per capita to labor gets stronger with development. And this is a channel that is not in our standard input-output model. So if you think about like a Chad Jones model where differences in input-output structures across countries are driven by distortions, like Shea-Klenow type of distortions, you don't get this type of feedback. Yeah, so it's kind of closer to some people know this nice paper by Antonio Ciccone, but talking about the big push from the big push literature back 20 years ago. All right, so let me just give you just a flavor of the full model.
Just because you're talking about like there is something that is not your model, but like maybe it's a little bit of big picture, but like you could think that part of your search there is search for importers, right? So you could have a small that's still doing great just because there's a big network of like supplier in terms of importers and things like that. So it's not, right? You're not there, you're not trying to capture that, and that's fine. Just kind of like for a big picture. It's not like we have to be a closed economy or something like that, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so a trade liberalization would be really interesting in this environment, and get a whole access to a whole new set of suppliers, and how you think about directing your search toward different sources of inputs. It would be yeah, super interesting. Okay, so let me just give you a flavor of the full model and what it looks like. So here in the simple model, right, you either you had bought an input or you bought the input that was used to produce that input. Here we're going to generalize this to what we call a production tree that's composed of production modules. So here is the output that I might produce. To produce that output, so in this example, I need 4 different particular inputs. For each of those inputs, I can either buy it from a supplier or make it in-house. If I buy it from a supplier, I'm done. If I make it in-house, might need some set of inputs to buy that. I might need some set of inputs to produce that one in-house. And you can think about this tree going on for however long you want it to go on. So firm is, again, it faces this make or buy decision at each node, and we're going to allow just heterogeneity across these different tree. It seems complicated, but it turns out it has a really nice recursive structure that kind of allows you to kind of solve this kind of branch by branch. So just to give you the types of propositions you can show is that within any industry, if a firm is born with higher productivity, they're going to, one is choose higher search effort at all the different nodes, right? There's a bunch of different possible suppliers to search for. Firms were born with higher productivity just want a higher search effort everywhere. And in addition, they're going to have strictly higher probability of outsourcing any input, right? And same logic goes through. The more I want to search, or the more downstream I search, the less there are, the more I can save on labor by searching more downstream. And so I have incentives to search more downstream, and to and my additional search helps me more find good suppliers to buy from than find good enough suppliers to combine with labor to buy from, because labor is always going to be kind of expensive. And so you're going to get that within any industry, the probability of outsourcing any intermediate input is going to be increasing in sales. So I think I'm just about out of time.
So the second proposition here seems to also imply that for the model, firms with larger sales are gonna be less labor intensive. In the data, it is a confirmed fact, or do you check it in the data?
Yeah, so among firms that produce a single product, the ones that sell more tend to have a slightly smaller intermediate input share. I mean, in the model, it's pretty clear because there's Cobb-Douglas production functions. In the world might be a little more complicated when you get away from Cobb-Douglas, but you do see that in the data, that firms that are more specialized tend to have smaller shares of intermediate inputs relative to primary inputs. Yeah, so thanks everyone. Thanks for the questions.
So I'm not sure there are like a lot of questions, so I think we can just kind of have like a bigger picture discussions, or if anyone wants to start.
Sure.
I have a narrow question, a model question. So if you so the logic you were talking about, the mixture of this fixed cost effect and the fact that you dilute some of the efficiency when you wrap it with your labor, kind of. I mean, could you have done this without the labor, just simply counting draws? You know what I'm saying? Like, I have my own draw, how good I would be at producing this, and there's some probability that I'm better than anybody else I sample, but the more I sample, this is less likely. Would that have worked? Or
so I think what we need is that you're drawing a supplier one step downstream and suppliers 2 steps downstream, and we need that the returns to each of those differ as you grow.
I see. So that would not. I see. I still need some way to.
So we actually have a question from Ayla Kaihan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correctly, but you can ask.
So I don't know. I missed just a couple seconds of conversation. So I am curious to what extent, I know this has nothing to do with, like, it's not in your setup, but I'm very curious to understand how we can think about risk management in this specific to the setup you have put together and the questions that you're asking.
What risks do you have in mind?
Well, the risks that affect the investment decisions in general. So it could have, I'm trying to sort of like formulate it in the way you've designed your model. I'm not super quick in my thinking, but the risks that could potentially influence the cash flows of the firm. I don't know if this is good enough for you.
So there's so there's a few different kinds of risk. One is supply chain risk, but that doesn't sound like what you have in mind. Another is if there's some kind of financial constraints and you're
it could be either. Yes, it could show up as either. Yes.
Yeah, so good question. So so financial constraints is something that's kind of interesting. To think a little bit about how that would interact with what we're doing. So I think most of the time financial constraints, I guess, limit. When people think about financial constraints in supply chains, often what you need is when you buy inputs, often you need to buy it on trade credit, I guess. And so if you're more likely to be, I'm trying to think through this on the fly here. So if you're more likely to be constrained, you may need to lean on, you may not be able to use trade credit, I suppose. And so they may need to do more things in-house. So that it's possible that might be driving some of these things. We can maybe think about how to look into that. Yeah, if you need if you're constrained, that makes it hard to use labor, then that might be difficult as well. So let's see. Yeah, maybe there's something we could look for that might be an indicator of whether the firms are financially constrained.
Yeah, again, just to, in case you're interested in this, I'm personally interested in. So I'm at the CFTC, and I'm kind of like looking at the firm's use of swaps market, the operating firm's use of swap markets. And it looks like I mean, it clearly seems to be a much more prevalent than we seem to think in general, because of the data, the detailed data we get at CFTC. And it looks like the channel is through the financial intermediaries. But the questions that you're asking, I feel like what I'm noticing in my analysis kind of is very much related to what you're finding. So that's why I'm curious, like how to think about the risk in your setting.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, right, so that's. I mean, you have to take a stand on what exactly the financial constraints are doing, right? Some people model financial constraints as the cost of labor, some as the cost of intermediate inputs, I mean, supply chain risk is another kind of interesting one that kind of would show up here. And sometimes people make the argument that that when firms are larger, they want to sort of have more control over their production process. For what it's worth, we're finding sort of not that. We're finding a pattern that goes in the opposite direction. But you know, for sure, firms at a certain scale are worrying about this kind of thing. So.
I mean, there is the Apple model, right? Like they have the suppliers, but they basically, you build a factory to supply specifically to Apple, so you have full control of the production.
Yeah,
that's not your firm.
Yes. So actually, one other important thing to note about what we're doing is, so what we have is a measure of specialization within plants, right? How many tasks are done within the same plant, which is a little different question than how much is done within the same firm. And I guess both firm boundaries and plant boundaries are a little bit fuzzy in the economic in the way we think about things, but what we have is about plants. I should say that the facts that I showed you in the beginning, they hold for, we can divide up plants into plants that are standalone plants versus plants that are members of multi-plant firms. And the facts we have seem to hold for the standalone plants. But if you're talking about questions like how much does Apple want to organize supply chain across different locations and stuff like that, our facts don't really speak to that per se. Super interesting, but we just don't have the data to get it, at least not yet.
Right, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep.
Can I ask a question about, I wonder if you can say something about efficient benchmark here?
Good question.
Because it seems to me, is it true that efficiently you actually want larger firm to buy? Just so that you can maybe make some comparison to that first. Like just assume that all the technology are the same. What's the efficient production here?
Good question. Okay, so there's a few different places where there are inefficiencies already. So when a firm is searching for suppliers, they're not completely internalizing the gains from their person who's buying it from them, or the person who's buying it from the customer's customers, etc. So the gains from search are of order. So in the simple model, they're of order like 1 over 1 minus alpha, whereas the cost is of order 1. And so there's like, this shows up in a lot of different models of production networks, that like you don't fully internalize all the gains from search.
So maybe just frictionless benchmark, not so much about inefficiency coming from the search technology, just about like in a frictionless benchmark, what should be the right way to produce?
Yeah, you do want, and again, I guess you do want the firms that are born with higher productivity to search more than the ones with lower productivity, because they're the ones who are, you know, they're more likely to show up as large in your economy. That's definitely going to be the case. I don't know whether it's like more than proportionally more or less than proportionally, but for sure you want the bigger ones to do more. Yeah, we kind of toyed with, so I didn't really say much about market structure here. We have a very simple market structure where when a firm is selling to a other firm as a downstream firm, they sell kind of at marginal cost, and when they sell to the final household, they sell at a markup. We've worked through different models of bargaining. Bargaining is kind of complicated in these networks, but it's in this one is kind of especially interesting because if you have a bunch of different suppliers who supply you an input, and they're all kind of necessary for the good, you can get these holdup problems, or right, each one kind of becomes a pivotal supplier, and so the amount of surplus they can extract is larger than the entire surplus. So you have to be a little creative with bargaining solutions to get things to work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So something that's when you talk about like you start motivating and talk about specialization, talk about that, and I think some way that something that people have in mind when talk about that is also like you specialize and allows you to learn how to produce better. You don't have that. You don't have that. Have you thought about it, or you have in an indirect way that we cannot?
Yeah.
My Q. What is the productivity like? Your Q does not increase if I reduce the number, right? It reduces increasing the indirect way because you're not spending, but like object, like how you think
Yeah,
about
so
that.
so it's funny. It shows up here in a certain kind of way. So I think that what's behind your question, right? When Adam Smith talked about the pin factor, he talked about a few different mechanisms. One of them is like, a worker works on this one task that can really learn that task well, as opposed to doing many tasks. And the way that kind of thing shows up here is when I need to search for, when I'm going to do a lot of stuff in house, I need to buy a lot of inputs. And I need to do a lot of tasks, and some of them I'm going to be okay at, some of them not so okay at, but I'm also going to exert a lot of search effort for all the different inputs that I'm going to buy. When I expect to specialize, if I'm really big, I only need to search, like in the simple model, I only need to search for one suppliers in one industry. I can really focus on searching in that industry. I'm not wasting all this search effort on these other more upstream industries. And so as you get bigger, it's almost like the returns to scale get stronger as I can kind of cut out these low returns to scale, searching very far upstream. And so that's George Stigler had this nice paper talking about how specialization was related to increasing returns to scale, that as you get bigger, you focus on your activities with a stronger increasing returns to scale. And that happens here, but it's through the search effort. I focus on the search activities that give me the biggest payoffs as I get bigger. The more I do it, the more I get to focus on those.
Yeah, so it's not like in the yeah, so it's okay. So
yeah, so it's not exactly learning how to do it. But that may reinforce things.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Ezra.